Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to day 2 of the Joint Special Operations University Forum on the future of SOF in strategic competition, focusing on the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. For those of you who missed yesterday, I am Brigadier General Retired Russ Howard, your host. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome you to this second day of the JSOU Forum. Again, this is the third in a series of JSOU Fora on SOF and strategic competition. These fora focus on matters relating to the use of and utility of special operations forces, exploring our role in a competitive global environment with highly complex, complicated, intersectional, and compound security challenges. We believe our second day will build on the insights gleaned from our first day panels. The forum has, just as yesterday, an eclectic and diverse group of panelists representing the joint, interagency, intergovernmental, multinational, commercial communities, as well as a breadth of academia. Our audience is equally as diverse, more than 1,000 in number, representing numerous commands, agencies, think tanks, and academic institutions. Before we begin, I would like to again cover some administrative points. First, this forum is being conducted at the unclassified level. All materials presented and discussions conducted must be unclassified. Second, this event is being recorded for future use. Your participation in this forum is consent for recording. Third, the opinions in this forum are those of the presenters and may not necessarily be the view of the United States government, Department of Defense, United States Special Operations Command, or Joint Special Operations University. Fourth, there will be several opportunities for questions throughout the 2 days. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the Vimeo chat function and preface it with #Q. This will help our curators more easily identify your question. Fifth, please visit the JSOU YouTube channel for access to the recorded content from this and other JSOU educational events. Go to YouTube and search for Think JSOU. Finally, your feedback is important to us. We'll provide you with an opportunity to share your thoughts and recommendations for each panel as well as the overall forum. In the event of technical difficulties, which we had a couple yesterday, such as losing the broadcast feed, please keep the event access information nearby should you need to log back in. Please note that the Vimeo login requirements are the same for today as they were yesterday. The topic for panel 6 is interests and linkages beyond the GCC. Moderating the panel is Dr. Rebecca Patterson from Georgetown University. Providing their perspectives are a distinguished panel of experts, including Dr. Evan Ellis from the Army War College, Dr. Marlene Laruelle from George Washington University, and Dr. Derek Reveron from the Naval War College. Dr. Patterson, actually retired Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Patterson, is a PhD and the Associate Director of the Center for Security Studies and Security Studies Program at Georgetown University, and Professor of the Practice of International Affairs in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She is the author of Challenge of Nation Building, Implementing Effective Innovation in the U.S. Army from World War II to Iraq. She's had several different important positions, including Deputy Director in the Office of Peace Operations, Sanctions, and Counterterrorism at the Department of State, retired Army officer with more than 22 years experience. She served overseas assignments in Iraq, Afghanistan, holds a PhD from George Washington University in National Security Policy, and a Bachelor of Science in Economics from the United States Military Academy. What is not in her bio is she's actually a superb economist and spent 3 years teaching the most advanced and difficult economics courses at United States Military Academy. Rebecca, we're looking forward to your comments and your panel. Thank you.
John Howard, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Welcome everyone and good morning. We have 3 great panelists this morning to kick off our day. Each of them will provide remarks and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So first we have Dr. Evan Ellis from the Army War College who will be speaking about China and Southcom. He's published over 280 works and his work is in over 27 countries across 4 continents. So Dr. Ellis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. For me, it's a pleasure to be part of this forum. Thanks to JSOU and thanks to all for their interest. I'm going to present a lot of information very quickly, so if we could put up my slides, please. So I want to start out with a little bit of a profile about Chinese advance in Latin America and the Caribbean. As you can see from the slide, China was first admitted into the World Trade Organization in 2001. But from that time, its trade presence expanded exponentially. But it was really after the 2008 global financial crisis that it, through mergers and acquisitions, began to dramatically expand its physical presence on the ground in the region. That physical presence caused it to have to be more concerned about its relationships with local communities and labor forces and governments. But I also mentioned this because we are in a period right now where with an even more profound crisis, it is highly likely that we will see in 2022 as Latin America recovers and as in 2008, European companies began to sell off their holdings in Latin America, we can expect another expansion of that Chinese presence. And indeed, we're already beginning to see it now. Next slide, please. I find it useful to think of Chinese activities in the economic space in Latin America in 3 areas. Obviously, resource sector activities, trying to get secure access to resources, including in the petroleum sector, in mining, in agricultural, but also in areas such as forestry and fishing, as we often see in places like Peru. The red circle you see, activities to try to secure access to markets for Chinese goods and services, particularly in strategic sectors and high value added activities such as telecommunications, high value added manufacturing, services such as banking and e-commerce, etc. And in the bottom, connectivity and digital activities. It's often underestimated the degree to which Chinese companies are involved not only in the construction and now operation of ports and increasingly the operation, not just the construction of roads and rail connectivity, but also things like the electricity sector, as well as e-commerce and telecommunications. Together, these are extremely important because they increasingly give Chinese companies a leverage over really what underlines the economic connectivity of Latin American economies. What you see from the slide in the middle, and I believe it's key to emphasize, that China primarily uses the intersection of these activities to achieve leverage. Now, some of that leverage is used to make sure that its companies are treated well, to silence critics in certain core political areas, whether Hong Kong or Tibet or Xinjiang. But increasingly also, it uses that economic leverage, and this is very different than what happened with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, to pursue a farther economic advance. You'll also note that in the slide that I put Chinese military and police activities off to the side, because I believe that while the importance of military engagement in the short term derives from that increasing economic presence and the importance of all-around engagement, and may have some uses in the long term, it's largely supporting and in support of which it's primarily economic focus. Next slide, please. With respect to a little bit more detail in resources and in market activities, just to emphasize a few key points. Number one, it's not just traditional petroleum and mining activities, but it's strategic minerals such as lithium. China very active in the lithium triangle in Chile with 25% interest by Tianqi in the SQM project there. It's a company Ganfeng, very active in the north of Argentina, as well as an often noted project in the Sonora Desert that's beginning by Ganfeng, as well as in Bolivia with TBEA and others. Also rare earths, for example, niobium, where it has 2 fairly significant operations in Brazil, among others. As I mentioned before, with physical infrastructure, it's not just Hutchison Whampoa operating in both sides of Panama Canal. It's also the presence in Freeport, very close to the United States, and increasingly the expansion into other port sectors. So, for example, a very important strategic minerals port at Chancay in Peru, construction of the port of Pasorja, which will become Ecuador's major port in the Pacific, 4 major ports in Brazil, including the construction of a mega port complex, São Luís, as well as the possibility for expansion into Central America with the port of La Union still on the table, China Merchants Port Holding operating the port of Kingston, et cetera, et cetera. Also important that it is not just ground infrastructure. One of the major projects right now is the dredging and operation as basically a hydro route, a riverine toll route in the Paraguay and Paraná rivers, which is the point of departure for the export of critical agricultural products for 5 South American countries, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. As I mentioned before, in the electricity sector, it's a lot of clean energy projects, 6 hydroelectric projects in Ecuador, 3 in Bolivia, 2 in Peru, 2 in Honduras, among others. Major wind and solar projects, including the Cachari project, which is the largest project in the hemisphere in the north of Argentina, as well as one just announced, a 1.1 gigawatt project near the port of JSOU in Brazil. In nuclear energy, China will be building a new nuclear reactor in the Atucha complex in Argentina, as well as interest in building in the Angra complex in Brazil. China also moving into electricity transmission, for example, tens of billions of dollars invested in Brazil, and more recently through acquisitions in Peru and Chile. Chinese companies now control literally 50% of electricity generation around the and distribution around the greater Lima area, as well as 57% around the greater Chile area, 57% in Chile. And again, when you consider this in combination with things like the operation of telecommunications networks, including e-commerce and banking, you really begin to understand the leverage of China really behind the fundamental connectivity of Latin American countries. Next slide, please. If we go to the slide here, digital activities of concern, what I would emphasize here is, in addition to telecom infrastructure and obviously 5G, which is a lot of concern, there are Chinese surveillance architectures like ECO 911 and BOL 110, as well as in the Cologne Free Trade Zone in Panama, as well as smart cities, which combines not only surveillance and digital facial recognition, but also financial data and other data on the participants. The risks are not just the capture of military relevant information, but also some of the intelligence advances when that data can be used to capture technology from competitors, can be used to win public bids, can be used to gain sensitive information that can compromise Latin American decision makers that will undermine potentially their autonomy of decision, as well as important to mention what I call digital authoritarianism. For example, in Venezuela, the Chinese company ZTE built what is called the Fatherland Identity Card. It's a system which was used to help not only with voting, but also food rationing with the famous clap boxes in Venezuela, and now is actually being used to decide who and track who gets vaccine. The danger thus is that these leftist populist authoritarian regimes open the door for these types of projects with China, but then China, by providing these types of prototype social credit systems, help to keep the authoritarian regimes in power, who then are in a better position to further deliver their economic and other goods to China. So it's a reinforcing effect that decreases U.S. influence and decreases U.S. democracy in the region. Next slide, please, with PRC Latin American military engagement. Here, just to mention that you have PRC arms sales, training, and professional military exercises, as well as presence activities. With respect to arms, of course, countries like Venezuela and Ecuador and Bolivia really opened the door for major end item exports. But Argentina now, with the return of the Panelists, we're seeing the negotiations just announced in the Argentine press this past week for the JF-17 or FC-1 fighter, which, if concluded, will be the most advanced fighter, Chinese fighter exported to the region. In addition, you also have other non-populous countries, for example, Peru, which has bought Chinese MLRS type systems, as well as Trinidad and Tobago, which has actually bought a Chinese offshore patrol vessel, among others. And you also see gifts being used to gain squad cars and motorcycles and things being used to gain good relations with Latin American police forces, not just military. In terms of training and professional military exercises, a lot of the people that we train ourselves in the United States are then going to trips to China in places like Chongqing for their short courses, as well as longer command and general staff courses in places like Nanjing. The PLA are sending people in small quantities to some of Latin America's best schools, such as the Lanceros course in Colombia and Tolamaida, as well as the Brazil's Jungle Warfare School, which the Chinese try to capture the best those schools have to offer and then replicate those in China, as they've done with Jungle Warfare School. With respect to presence, the Chinese were about 8 years in Haiti with their military, police, and the MINUSTA operation. They've sent their hospital ship Peace Ark to the region 3 times. They've made at least 25 port calls. And so these types of things are relevant, these types of institutional engagements and presence operations, even without formal basing agreements, if the Chinese are ever in a position where they need to conduct military operations in the region. And finally, with respect to what COVID-19 is doing in the region, as I've already suggested from one of my first slides, you have the possibility for significant advances. Certainly with respect to vaccine diplomacy, 12 Latin American states are now receiving Chinese vaccines, including Brazil, where expedited access convinced the relatively pro-US Bolsonaro regime to rethink their decision to exclude Huawei from 5G. Similarly, in the pro-US Abinader government in the Dominican Republic, again, expedited vaccine access helped to convince that government to allow Huawei into 5G there. There was an attempt, although failed, to use vaccine access to convince the Abdo Benitez government in Paraguay to abandon Taiwan and move to the PRC. You also see that beyond vaccine diplomacy, you have the increasing importance of Chinese trade with its strong economic recovery. So for Brazilian soy exports, Chilean copper, El Salvador and sugar, Ecuador and shrimp, very, very important leverage that the Chinese now have in this particular period. The expansion of leftist governments in the region, the deepening role of the left in Argentina, where they've contracted almost $5 billion for expansion of the Belgrano-Caracas rail system, certainly with the return of the Mas government in Bolivia, and now the prospect of a leftist government in Peru with the possible victory of Pedro Castillo in the second round of the Peruvian elections in June. Again, even in places like Mexico, close to the United States, where the Chinese are already very active in infrastructure projects such as the Maya train, with Pemex, with the Dos Bocas refinery, in the Perdido Basin in the oil sector, and with the Zuma electricity project, the prospects for, again, an increasingly desperate AMLO government there to turn farther to the Chinese. As I mentioned before, the prospect of Western companies beginning to sell off their assets as Latin America recovers will open up the door for Chinese companies to expand even further. And also in the battle for Taiwan, with, again, 5 countries in the Caribbean, 4 countries in Central America, plus Paraguay, being in a position to need to think about flipping recognition because of their desperate need for economic engagement in the post-COVID environment. Again, opening doors for China to dramatically expand their access. But as it does, just as occurred in the post-2008 period, that expanded Chinese presence will occur in a Latin America, which is because of COVID, poorer, with higher levels of unemployment, with different patterns of organized crime, with greater social mobilization, as we're already seeing in Colombia. And so Chinese will have challenges, and that will present both opportunities as well as concerns for the United States. So those are my initial remarks. I look forward to the rest of the panel and to engaging in Q&A later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ellis. Next, Dr. Marlene Laruelle will be speaking about Central Asia, the New Great Game. Like Dr. Ellis, Dr. Laruelle is a prolific writer, having published 9 books since 2008 and numerous journal articles in edited volumes, and that's just in English. She's also published 8 books in French and 2 books in Russian since 1999. Over to you, Dr. Laruelle.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So indeed, we're now moving to great power competition in Central Asia, talking mostly about the Russia-China partnership there, because the US are really finding itself in a very kind of second-tier position of power in the region now. Can we move to the second slide, please? Yeah, just a map of the region for those of you who needs to remember the very difficult location of Central Asia, sandwiched between Russia, China, Iran, and Afghanistan. So not the easiest place to be located in the current situation. Next slide, please. So what is the background of the situation there? Where China rising in power, obviously, and Russia stagnating in some domain, even losing some of its influence, in some other retaining it. So China has become Central Asia's main economic partner after the 2008 crisis. Russia is now second, even sometimes third, after the European Union. As you know, Central Asia is a key region for the Belt and Road initiatives. For China, the level of Chinese investment in the region is really very high, with very few kind of political strings attached, except a very high, massive state debt that is really becoming problematic for the two smallest and weakest, poorest countries, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, whose level of debt toward China is really increasing, like about 2/3 of the state debt of Tajikistan is linked to Chinese money. China played a big role in the region in trying to foster regional integration, even if each time Chinese projects deal with the local governments at the bilateral level, still China is kind of putting all of them at the same table for regional integration. If we look on the other side, the Russian side, we see that the Russian economic presence in Central Asia has first retreated in the 1990s, then recovered in the 2000s and in the early 2010s with the launch of the Eurasian Economic Union. And then since the 2014 economic crisis sanction, it's kind of stagnating. The problem for Russia economically in Central Asia is that it's seen as a very unreliable partner for investment. Russia promises a lot and does very little. The other issue for Central Asia is that Russia is promoting its own regional integration structure, and especially for the economic sector, the Eurasian Economic Union, and is doing everything it can to try to limit any kind of Central Asian regional integration. So that's for the economic sector. If we look at what is happening in the more kind of security strategic framework, then that's a reverse relationship. Russia is still largely dominating the security realms in the 5 Central Asian countries. Russia is still the main country selling military equipment to Central Asian countries. Also, those who still have a small military industrial complex like Kazakhstan are almost entirely tied up with Russia. Russia is still offering the majority of educational training for Central Asian military. In Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, between 60 and 90% of the local military senior official and average soldier got some kind of short-term or long-term training, military training in Russia. Russia is also providing a very intense military joint bilateral or multilateral military exercise with the country in the region. When it's at the multilateral level, it's done with the Collective Security Treaty Organization. But for the 2 countries who are not member of it, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, there are still the possibility of having bilateral military training. Russia, on the other side, is in a much more modest position in the security realm. It has been trying to avoid kind of entering that zone of control of Russia. But we have seen since the last few years, China trying to be more active or more visible in the security realm, especially with Tajikistan, developing modest military cooperation at the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan in the Vakhan corridor. So you see this division of labor working pretty well. China dominates the economic sector, Russia dominates the strategic sector, and the relationship function pretty well over the region. Next slide, please. Can we have the next slide? Oh, yes, thanks. What we see is that you have 2 different set of strengths and weaknesses for each of the country. Russia still can play on its Soviet legacy. If it's kind of getting an old one, we will be celebrating or commemorating the 30th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union in a few months. It still has a lot of influence on how the political elites in Central Asia are shaped. It still has a huge cultural and of course linguistic influence. Russian language is still the main language talked in the region. The Russian media influence has been growing since the 2000 and especially after the 2014 crisis. And you still have millions of Central Asians going regularly to Russia because they have family contact, or you have also about 5 million labor migrants from Central Asia working in Russia. So what Russia is able to get for sure from all the Central Asian states is their support in international affairs. Usually the 5 states are always voting in favor of Russia at the UN Security Council, for example. At the same time, we are noticing a rise of criticism coming from the Central Asian public audience toward Russia's colonial attitude. So we can see that this kind of cultural supremacy over Central Asia is really now heavily declining with younger generation who haven't been raised in the Soviet framework. On the other side, for China, it's a much more complicated picture. China has very low knowledge of Central Asia, and Central Asia very low knowledge of China. The Chinese cultural influence of power in the region hasn't been working very well, even if China is investing a lot of money in trying to develop people-to-people contact. We can see in the region a rise of xenophobia very clearly, a fear of Chinese hidden goals in the energy sector, in the raw material extraction, in the agricultural sector, which is a big element of tensions for the Central Asian public opinion. There are growing doubts about the Belt and Road Initiative, especially because it's allowing for building infrastructure, but it's not giving jobs, and finding jobs is the key issue for the Central Asian society. And so far, China hasn't had any interesting proposal in terms of job creation for Central Asia. And then, of course, what is happening with the re-education camp for Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities had some impact on Central Asian public opinion, especially in Kazakhstan, where you have a relatively large Uyghur minority, and also where people care about what is happening to the Kazakh minority on the other side of the border. And so clearly Chinese kind of soft power, or kind of harmonious, so-called harmonious rise in power, has been really challenged in Central Asia. And there is now growing criticism among the public society, the civil society, in the social media, about what is happening in China, as a sign that what China is doing to the region is a dangerous trend. And of course, if we compare with what Evan was saying about Latin America, the big difference for Central Asia is that they have territorial contiguity with China, right? So China is just on the other side of the border. The demographic disbalance is huge. So any small population movement in China looks like a huge population movement in Central Asia. And so the fear of any kind of Chinese agricultural colonialism or invasion is still very much spread in Central Asia. Next slide, please. So what we see about the Russia-China relationship is that it's more a partnership than a competition, right? There is no more competition on the economic side. There is only potentially competition on security issues. But as I said, China so far is very much respecting Russia's red line in terms of its security hegemony in the region. And then the partnership is really based on very kind of strong elements. Both countries are, of course, against any kind of presence of the US in the region, but they also have a broader relationship that works pretty well in the Far East, in the Arctic, and globally. And so for sure, even if there are sometimes some tensions between Russia and China in Central Asia, none of the two big powers consider Central Asia worth a conflict, given the state of their relationship and the state of both their tensions with the US. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is seen as a success by both of them, and we can notice how both Moscow and Beijing are trying to adjust the narrative so that looks like they are working together. So Russia created this Greater Eurasia narrative as a way to try to accommodate the Belt and Road Initiative and China's action in the region. China created the so-called Polar Silk Road as a way to negotiate with Russia its growing role in the Arctic. And then both Russia and China have a partly similar vision of the world order. And what I think is really key for the region is that they both of them trust each other on their capacity to compromise in the region if needed. So they know that if they have tension in the region, they can negotiate with each other and find a kind of medium way, while both consider that it's impossible to do the same with the US. Next slide, please. So last slide, so what do we see? We see that Central Asia has been really used as a test zone for the Russia-China relationship. It's one of the first zone where both countries already early in the 2000s were able to find mutually beneficial strategies in what they consider a post-American order. And I think on that, Central Asia is really a fascinating case of a region where the US has been investing so much money and human capital and military security cooperation in the 2000s and totally retreated in the 2010s to the point that now the US, as I was saying in introduction, is really a second-tier country for the region. Russia and China trust each other in their own priorities toward the West and are both ready to compromise, as I was saying, against the US. So it's the two partners against the third one. They both have good, successful strategies of avoidance, like knowing that if there are tension, it's possible to negotiate them. But still, and I will conclude on that, you of course have some doubts remaining. The Chinese side is worried about Russia's presence and hegemony in the kind of short term in the region. For example, if one of the Central Asian regimes was to collapse and insecurity was to raise in the region, would Russia intervene? If Russia doesn't intervene, how China would be sure to secure its own assets in the region? Would China need to intervene? So we can see a lot of doubt on the Russian capacity to control Central Asia on the Chinese side. On the Russian side, we see the reverse doubt and anxiety more on the long run. The Russian elites are, of course, very well aware that the more the relationship will be growing, the more Russia will find itself on the kind of junior position toward China. And that's, of course, is on the long run, the key issue for the Russian side will be to know if one day China will try to become the key security partner for Central Asia. And in that case, Russia's red line will have to be renegotiated. So you see a good region to look at how this partnership without the EU in a region where the US is now really in retreat, how this Russia and China are able to build a relatively flexible relationship. They have tensions, but they know how to manage it. And so far, the partnership has been working. And I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laruelle. Next, Dr. Derek Reveron from the U.S. Naval War College will be speaking about security cooperation and great power competition. In addition to his teaching accolades, having recently won a Teaching Innovator Prize as well as an Excellence in Teaching Award from Harvard, Dr. Reveron also spent time in the nonprofit world, having implemented and evaluated democracy promotion programs for the NGO Heartland International. Over to you, Dr. Reveron.
Okay, hey, great, and thank you for including me today, and fantastic discussions that continue through JSOU. I'll start sort of, from the top in the sense, I do not think the US can compete economically with China. I think the structure are just simply too different. US-based multinationals are driven by profit motive and right, free enterprise gives those countries give those companies the decision how to pursue their own interests, not the national interest, which I think is a core difference between state-owned enterprises and China. A clear area, though, that I'll maybe shift the topic to say, well, it's really not so bad, is on defense cooperation, where I do think the United States does dominate through our various security cooperation, security assistance programs. So for the doctrinaires out there, forgive me if I use them interchangeably. Defense, I'll just leave it at defense cooperation to maybe make everybody happy. I use this photo to sort of show, not just simply because I'm a Navy civilian and think, right, the enduring relevance of sea power, but rather to really highlight a key advantage the United States does have over every other country in the world, and that's on defense cooperation. And so if you sort of look at what's going on, it's a multinational exercise between the US, Japan, and Canada. If you look in the foreground, that's a Japanese destroyer. So while the ship was built in Japan, if you sort of zoomed in and look at different radars or weapon systems, you would see made in America. And I imagine if we could sort of zoom in even further and look at the commanding officer of that ship is likely a graduate of the U.S. Naval War College. And I think the same would be true for some of the officers on the Canadian ships. And if you looked up in the sky too, you would see again a multinational aircraft. working together for common purpose. And that's an area where the U.S. does dominate and clear advantages over China and Russia. So I'll promise to make sure I've got some other non-Navy examples. So next slide, please. As we sort of transition, pivot from this idea, right, centered around global war on terrorism the last 20 years, I always find it helpful to remind everyone that security cooperation was not, well, I think it accelerated, and certainly from a shift from Title 22, Department of State dominance on the budget side, to Title 10 through GWAT, we have been doing security cooperation for a very long time. I just reached back to President Reagan to remind us it's vital, integral component of our national strategy. And then different images, you can see, the mountain range there. That's the Marshall Center in Garmisch, Germany, where it's a multinational training and education center, not only for U.S. European Command, but has become global. To the right, the advising mission that many of us have been doing for decades. And then finally, my favorite example on the air side is you've got U.S.-made F-16s flown by U.S.-trained Japanese pilots escorting U.S. bombers in a deterrence mission in a common concern as it relates to North Korea and China. Next slide, please. Given our host in terms of, thinking about internal issues, there's a lot of conflict in the world today, and this is probably an area where, I think SOCOM in the United States excels in terms of assisting other countries confront their internal challenges. And so that graphic is from a Swedish think tank, SIPRI, and to read it, the greenish color are intra-state conflict. Some sort of civil war, and that salmon color is when those civil wars get internationalized. So, for example, Afghanistan can be characterized as a civil war. It's internationalized in the sense of the U.S. and its allies have been supporting the current government in Kabul, or you can look at Syria, for example, where you have Russia supporting the Assad regime, the U.S. and its allies supporting sort of the various versions of those resisting the Assad regime. So there's a lot of work to be done in the security sector, and this is clearly an area, as I start to think about great power competition and how it might play out in the security space, this is one area where you are seeing increases in Russian and Chinese weapons exports. You are seeing cases in Syria is a clear case of great power competition between the US and Russia. Or I think as Dr. Laruelle had mentioned, in terms of Central Asia, you'll start to see that. And as if the US sort of withdraws, both from a personnel perspective, but, in my mind, the question mark with the Afghan Security Force Fund looks like it's going to continue for some time. There should be competition that takes place in Central Asia between the US and Russia and China from a defense perspective. Next, please. Again, some other images, as it relates, I want to highlight too that, often over the last 20 years, we often think security cooperation is for weak states, Afghanistan, Nigeria, and such. But again, the images try to highlight that it's just not for weak states. And so the U.S.'s, I think, comparative advantage. So if China's comparative advantage globally is natural resource extraction, I think a comparative advantage for the U.S. globally are weapons exports and training. And so, you see a picture of the Indian P-8. Of course, on the right is Patriot missile system, which is a global commodity. You see Aegis ashore in Central Europe. And of course, the security cooperation example we never discuss too much as a clear success is Israel and a nice display of the Israeli Air Force. Next, please. So as it relates to great power competition, really just drawing from the Biden administration's interim guidance they released a couple months ago, again, reaffirming what, I offered at the start with President Reagan, that allies matter. And in terms of the Biden administration specifically linked bolstering security cooperation and defending our network of allies to deter Chinese aggression counter threats. So I think this area of defense cooperation is going to continue as it has been, and the U.S. is in an extremely good position to do this. Next, please. First is, globally, the pie chart, I think, is CIPRI again, the Swedish think tank. The U.S. has relative capacity when it comes to defense. So I don't want to argue. I don't think, by dollar, CIPRI does try to put this in, I think, in PPP. The U.S. is the largest defense spender in the world. And my caveat would be we divide our defense budget globally, where China can concentrate in Northeast Asia. That's true. Russia can concentrate in Central Europe. That's true. The U.S. still has a very large military. The U.S. still has a full spectrum capability. The U.S. is a significant military actor is sort of my main point here. China certainly catching up, not so much on the defense export side, right, for its own military modernization. But as we know, at least from U.S. history, if we want to mirror image for a second, then we'll probably see defense exports in certain areas. They do quite well in terms of unmanned systems, and certainly surveillance and other ISR technology. They do quite well. Next, please. And so, as I try to think about, where is the U.S. position, as it relates to defense cooperation, again, I think it's quite strong. This is really just sort of a 20-year look at the U.S. And so that first row deals with status of forces agreements. And so this is the agreement that enables another country to host U.S. military forces. And you can see over this 20-year period, it has tripled from 40 to about 120 today. And that's a strong basis to continue partnership with other countries and gives the U.S. A leg up as it relates to other countries. Likewise, you can look by allies. If you can go back to the table, please. The NATO alliance has doubled in the last 20 years, and I think if you sort of pulled out a Post-it note, maybe one of those smaller ones, you can list Russia's allies, you can list China's allies. And where the U.S. As it relates to globally speaking has a significant number of allies in the world. The next two rows really get to the point, Congress is highly supportive of U.S. defense cooperation around the world. The first one, foreign military financing, enabling the purchase of hardware by our partners. And the second one, I think relevant for JSOU, and certainly, Evan and I, since we work for PME institutions, international military education and training, again, has more than doubled over the last 20 years. And so the international officers that we get to educate and be in our classrooms are always, right, a fantastic addition to being a professor at a PME school, and that pays long-term dividends. And then probably the last two just relate when countries bring their own money through foreign military sales or direct commercial sales. You can see it's just right in the case of FMS quintupled, and direct commercial sales again quintupled. That the United States has opened up its arms industry to the world, and so I think when India buys a P-8. For example, that's giving us at least a 30-year relationship, and I think that's important, and that's something that quite certainly China can't say. Russia can with a couple of countries, just because again, when you buy a weapon system, you're really buying generations long relationship. Next, please. I want to always highlight, right, defense cooperation is great. I'm a believer, but I think there's also pitfalls associated with it. And I think with GPC sort of brings out, again, some of the tensions that exist is, conventional forces, really want to, right, they see oftentimes partnership or exercises with partners can be a diversion from our core mission set. And that's why I think it's important to sort of retool and make sure those exercises and those partnerships, fundamentally first support U.S. national interests. I think one of the pitfalls of American culture and defense culture is we always want to solve other people's problems. And sometimes we forget about, like, really we should be grounded in U.S. national interest first. Second, sort of really related to sort of ISIS rise in Iraq and Syria is we saw the loss of equipment and technology that were transferred to the Iraqi military that later gets captured by ISIS and used and then later destroyed by the United States in combat. So that's a key aspect of this. We can rely on our partners sometimes too much. And I do think coalition warfare is a norm. And if you really probably reach back to the American Revolution, where France was a key partner for the US to sort of liberate the colonies from the British Empire. We've always done this. But we have to make sure that in cases like in more recent cases, whether it's in Afghanistan, when we sort of shifted from 2001 to 3 or 4 or 5 to Europeans, we can't overly rely and get dissatisfied at the result. I think the Biden administration and others have really highlighted sort of this guilt by association problem. Supporting the Saudis, for example, in Yemen, has been viewed as a negative of our security cooperation efforts. And then finally, is the U.S. is not the only country out there when it comes to these programs. Certainly, if you drive by a coalition village to combatant command, you understand the U.S. is not alone. And so we need to make sure that we're coordinating with our partners when we do these programs. Next, please. In terms of sort of going down, thinking about the future. So if you go back to that, keep the slide here, but, thinking back to there's a lot of conflict in the world. It's just mostly internal. And so if the U.S. is to engage in those and be driven by U.S. national interest first, we need to really think about the internal challenges there. I think sometimes in these discussions of defense cooperation, we get lost in terms of, well, why should the U.S. be supporting El Salvador against gangs? Well, in El Salvador, and Dr. Ellis can get into this later, gangs in El Salvador are a national security threat. In the U.S., they're a law enforcement threat, thankfully. So this can require, some challenges in terms of thinking, how does U.S. Southern Command and Military Command support El Salvador in its fight against gangs? Likewise with external challenges, we know conflict often occurs with countries that neighbor each other. And so we have to be sensitive in terms of the balance of power there. And we also, in terms of perceptions of U.S. and China, on trade, China dominates. I mean, China is the #1 trade partner for the United States. So we have to be sort of recognize that and then be aware of how that affects broader governmental decisions, not only within Washington, but also with our partners in their capitals. And then, maybe the last, just because of time, question to kind of highlight is, an area I think we can improve in security cooperation is, the militaries are good at doing assessments, militaries are good at doing plans. When we identify gaps in a partner that have little to do with military, we need to do better at cueing the rest of the U.S. government on how the perennial search for the last 20 years is engage the interagency, whole of government, full dime, get all of that involved. We still have to kind of come back to that. I know it's an old argument. We've been talking about trying to figure this out for 20 years. We haven't figured it out, and we still need to do a better way to identify ways to engage, other departments within the U.S. government, and oftentimes I think at the country team level, which is an interagency in action, they do some really good assessments. Unfortunately, the resourcing often just comes from defense, and so I think defense can kind of help highlight those areas. Next, please. Again, pictures, I think what success looks like, a U.S. bomber getting fuel from a French tanker, a European standing watch in, I think, Kosovo in this case, Bahrain hosting a U.S. headquarters, in this case, Naval Forces Central Command, multinational exercises, and of course, coalition operations. I think the height of in Afghanistan, I think ISAF had about 50 countries that were there. Some very positive ones. The one that used to make me smile in the morning when I walked by the flagpole was seeing Bosnia's flag. Because when my military career started, right, it was civil war in former Yugoslavia and Bosnia. And so it's great to see a country like Bosnia now being a net contributor, even though there still are multinational forces in Bosnia, but Bosnia is a net contributor to defense globally. And so I'll conclude there and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Dr. Reveron. We'll now open the floor to questions from the audience. Please feel free to enter your questions in the chat. So Dr. Ellis spoke a little bit about the impact of COVID in the Southcom area of responsibility. Could each of you speak about how might the US use this moment as an opportunity vis-a-vis strategic competition? Are there places where there are new or different opportunities for engagement due to COVID? Can we start in reverse order with Dr. Reveron first?
Yeah, no, I mean, clearly the U.S. is a global leader on pharmaceutical and vaccine development. I think there's over 200 vaccines in development in some stage, but, U.S.-based companies are doing quite well in terms of vaccine production. And so, I'll sort of put it back, because I saw Secretary Austin yesterday tweet out U.S. National Guard have vaccinated about 10 million people inside the United States in the last month. So there's an inherent ability to deliver humanitarian assistance within DoD. And so if there is a decision to sort of move along those lines, there's clearly the capacity to do that. And I think too, as U.S. vaccination rate goes, I know Russia and China have sort of had their play. And again, I think, Chile, for example, I think is primarily a Sinovac user. And, you see within Central Europe, primarily a Sputnik 5 sort of user. This can be a wedge. We've seen in the past, whether, earthquake relief, tsunami relief, providing humanitarian assistance has been in the past a key way to sort of bridge gaps with partners. It's a short-term fix, and certainly, but as we sort of know, disease knows no boundaries, and you can see with these mutant variations happening, it is in U.S. national interest to contribute globally to vaccination.
Yeah, if I can add for Central Asia. Well, in Central Asia, everything is either the Russian or the Chinese vaccine, and that would be difficult for them to access any other kind of vaccine. But I think one way to look at that is that the region has been really developing its pharmaceutical ties with India, which is, of course, a big producer. And so, the situation is really terrible in India now with COVID, but let's say that once the crisis is over, you could imagine that the US cooperation with India over pharmaceutical industry and the production of vaccine could be a way for US production or US cooperation to re-enter Central Asia through India, right? And that's part of a long debate in the US about how to make the best use of India as a kind of a proxy or key partner for the US to be involved in Central Asia, because the US directly confronting or in face of Russia and China in terms of vaccine strategy will not work.
For me, vaccine, the issue of vaccine and COVID is both a challenge and a threat. I already mentioned the challenge part, but in terms of an opportunity, as Derek also mentioned, although China has gotten way out ahead of the United States with its Sinovac, its Sinopharm, its CanSino vaccines, really taking advantage of the relative control of COVID-19 in the country and the ability to ramp up its vaccine production. As Derek mentioned, in Chile, relatively low efficacy. Sinovac tests about 3% efficacy on first dose, 50% on second dose. And although Chile and many other countries went with the Chinese vaccine just because of a lack of other alternatives, that's having certain repercussions. In Colombia, the same thing. Colombia is really just on its back right now with vaccines. 75% of all vaccines received by Colombia actually are the Chinese vaccine because others have not arrived. what the United States really needs. And already there's been some talk about this both within the Biden administration and on the Hill. So this is in process. But as we move beyond 50, 60% vaccination in the United States, really ramping up what we provide to the region. The reality is we've already committed about $4 billion to the World Health Organization. But the problem is we get very little credit for that. And that program thus far has had some problems in actually getting vaccines into arms in Latin America because of logistics and other considerations. And so some really directed, and as Derek mentioned, use of U.S. military to push that is very important. Also mentioned again, Russia is also moving forward, but Russia has some vulnerabilities with respect to both Sputnik 5 and the new one. Although their efficacy is higher than that of the Chinese, they've had serious production difficulties as well as a competing demand in Russia, which has really prevented Russia from living up to some of its commitments. Also, obviously, there are a number of different, not only health-related challenges, but also poverty and security-related challenges, of course, which really highlight the importance of thinking about, what our posture is to countries such as El Salvador, such as Honduras, such as Guatemala, and the rest of the region, really helping them through those difficult moments, helping do what often the U.S. has done best, through State Department and of course a DoD, supervised security assistance, security sector assistance programs, which is really to help governance, which is to help for transparent things. So even though you have commercial engagement with China, you really prevent that from some of the worst, most predatory aspects that we've seen to date. But again, it's something that we really need to mobilize and move forward more, taking advantage of those things in the region. And certainly DoD has a role to play with security sector assistance.
Thanks so much, all three of you. So a question for Dr. Ellis. Northcom and Southcom leaders have warned repeatedly about China's involvement in Latin American infrastructure projects, especially ports. Are there any signs China is thinking or planning to leverage those investments for security purposes or military advantage?
Great question. There's a long-term and a short-term component to this. For me, in the short term, China has far too many constraints in terms of its financial and economic dependence and desire to get Western technologies. If you think about how expensive provocative actions are in this era of interdependence, and frankly, that although the PLA is developing global operations, you see it in Africa right now, it's really not in a position to pay the expense to project force into Latin America. I mean, you do see some moves again on the African side with, for example, Djibouti, as well as counter-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia. But it really doesn't need that provocation yet in Latin America. It's not in a position to do so. What I do see, however, over the long term, I think this is important. Number one, in the short term, PRC economic influence is the biggest threat to our constraints to our access and our ability to limit PRC access, because oftentimes it's those economic inducements that even though our forces are doing a great job with our exercises and our training programs and sending people to WINSEC, et cetera, our SCO teams get ambushed in that area. But over the long term, if we imagine, for example, a war that starts in Taiwan in 2030, and let's imagine that we guess wrong, we lose a couple of carriers and other capital ships, and all of a sudden it looks like a longer term bet. It is entirely possible that not only will you see the PRC operating in terms of using its economic capacity or its ability to introduce diversionary things or to put U.S. deployment and sustainment operations at risk from the Western Hemisphere, much like has happened out of the Gulf of Korea, in World War II. But you will also see the prospect that if some countries are, permit the PRC to access those military to military engagements today, the familiarity with the ports, things like that, will actually allow, even without a formal base agreement, PLA forces to be able to come in a relatively short amount of time to be able to put certain U.S. assets in the hemisphere at threat without an agreement. So I don't expect to see any formal agreements either in La Union and Salvador or Panama or elsewhere, but one needs to look at the security relationships for understanding the rate at which the PRC in a future conflict could use that familiarity to have an operationally useful presence very, very quickly. And so we need to keep that in mind as we look at those engagements.
Thanks so much. A question for Derek. With countries that have longstanding security ties with U.S. rivals like Russia, how should the U.S. balance its desire to strengthen relations with its efforts, such as sanctions, to move those away from buying those rivals' weapons?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think probably the example maybe on the person's mind is Russia selling S-400s to Turkey, and that can certainly drive a wedge. And so if we sort of move Turkey off the table, so to speak, and look at other cases, I would say it's quite possible, the two can coexist. And I think we put our partners in a difficult position if we force them to choose when there's really no risk to U.S. security. I think in the Turkish case, the argument was made, you don't want to plug in a Russian S-400 missile system into the NATO one, right, for various reasons. But in other cases, and I'll use, Colombia as an example to maybe pull Dr. Ellis in, is, in Colombia, they have proven they can fly Russian-made Mi-17 helicopters and U.S.-made Black Hawk helicopters. And, frankly, they do it quite well. The two systems are complementary, and the U.S. never forced Colombia to choose. And so I think we have to sort of be careful, that sometimes other countries matter. One area that we might, and I'll just say, just from a production perspective, no one challenge me on whether it's effective, whether it's cost effective or not, but like F-35, I mean, one of the things I like about the F-35 program, it was internationalized. And so a lot of things happen when you internationalize a weapon system program. One, it sort of ensures the U.S. gets to drive it. Two, you ensure you get interoperable partners because they buy the same stuff. Three, you keep that other country's industry kind of moving, but right in a way that contributes to a larger whole. And so there's lots of advantages to do that. And so I would say if you are concerned about sort of China or Russia selling weapons to another country, maybe the opportunity, instead of making that country choose between U.S. and Russian made, maybe it's look at U.S. partnership to help that country's industry. Because I think Dr. Ellis, certainly he said this here, and then certainly in his writings, highlight is right. And I think Dr. Laruelle got it too, is right, the people understand what Chinese investment means now. It's not developing local workers. It's not developing local industry. It's really dumping if we put it in those economic terms. And so I think kind of a new avenue that to kind of think about is, how can the U.S. defense sector help other countries' defense sectors in common platforms as a way to sort of negate the negativity of a Russian or Chinese made system, rather than saying choose between a U.S. or a Russian system.
All right, this question is first for Dr. Laruelle and then for Dr. Ellis. So to the extent that the US and its allies can push for more transparency on agreements, economic, military, and other, would this level the playing field in Central Asia and Latin America for competition?
I can begin for the Central Asian case. I mean, one of the problems for the US, there are several problems, right? One of them is that the price of what US can sell to Central Asia is usually too expensive for what the Central Asian states can afford, right? So in terms of energy cooperation, it's doable, but in the other sector, like, I don't know, agribusiness, for example, it's almost impossible for US firms to be competitive for what the Central Asian market can afford, right? And that's something on which it's just difficult for the US to change that situation. The second issue is the kind of long-term engagement of the US. The Central Asian states, seen from their perspective, often feel that they feel insecure about the long-term US engagement in their favor. So if they have to take risk in suddenly challenging Russia's domination, they want to be sure that the US will stand behind them on the long run, right? And so the general perspective, and that's the Central Asian interpretation of the US leaving Afghanistan, right? And so we may discuss their interpretation, but that the way they see them is that, okay, if we take risk to side more with the US against Russia, and then suddenly the US is leaving, well, Russia is not leaving, right? Russia is the geographical neighbor. Russia will always be there and will always have ways to kind of retaliate. So there is this kind of capacity of the US. It's probably in our storytelling, we are missing some elements, of soft power to really convince about long-term engagement. And of course, for them, the experience of Afghanistan is like, don't side with the US, because at the end, you are not sure they stay, but the other neighbors, those who are the real geographical neighbors, they will still be there and you will still have to deal with them on the long run.
With respect to Latin America, the answer is yes, absolutely. It can make a difference, transparency and other things like pushing for good governance, but we have a lot of work to do to get it right. I mean, it makes sense in principle, and there's really two dimensions. One is the things that we insist for. In other words, we have the leverage to use our economic engagements and other type of things that we do, our security assistance, access to the U.S. market, to insist to a certain degree that our partners conduct their operations and their dealings with the Chinese and others in a transparent fashion, that they use rule of law, et cetera. And to a certain degree, that has worked in limiting the Chinese advance, because oftentimes what happened is you have Chinese elites, and I believe this happens in Africa and Central Asia and other places as well. Win-win means that the Chinese companies, with little constraint by the PRC government, engage with local elites. They get sidebar deals for their friends and cousins and others in terms of intermediation contracts and things like that. And it really sells the people of the country down the river. And so if you insist on transparency, you constrain the ability of the Chinese to do those type of deals. At the same time, good governance is a key, because, and what I mean by that is, for example, more effective planning on the front end. For example, Panama, the government of Juan Carlos Varela wanted a $4.1 billion high-speed train that wasn't anywhere in the Panama's 2030 logistics plan. You also need, obviously, more effective evaluations of competition. The problem often is not just government-to-government deals, but many times governments in Latin America don't have the capability to effectively evaluate the Chinese deal in an apples-to-apples way. This is a problem with the Route 32 project in Costa Rica, for example. And then on enforcement on the back end, oftentimes the Chinese are often more aggressive than others in not complying with labor constraints, not complying with environmental constraints, which gives them a cost advantage over Western groups, both European and the United States, which are so constrained. The problem, however, is that we have serious difficulties in terms of the level of funding in short term and lack of interagency cooperation, for example, in State Department-led programs, in terms of the relative paucity of USAID programs. And frankly, there's a lot that we can do on the U.S. side. If you think, for example, about the possibility of leveraging civil affairs programs, the possibility of leveraging more PSYOPs and things like that. But oftentimes, the SCO teams do not have the opportunity to coordinate beyond just kind of last-minute embassy level coordination in terms of how relatively limited DoD programs plug into what state or what USAID is trying to do to really kind of make a difference in giving our partners meaningful capabilities and not just kind of sprinkle a few med-readies and things in the region. And so absolutely it can make a difference. Matter of fact, it works a lot better than trying to tell our partners that they can't do business with China because they just ignore us and resent us for it. But to do that, we need to rethink doctrine, we need to rethink resources, we need to rethink authorities like Section 333 authorities to really make that work.
Question for Dr. Laruelle. Why does Russia trust its relationship with China in Central Asia? What has China done to earn this trust?
Well, I think China shows respect to what Russia considers its red line, right? China, if you read the Chinese sources, which I don't, but we have good studies on that side, we can see how China seems to be really always like recognizing Russia's supremacy. Russia is the regional hegemon in Central Asia, and China positions itself only as the kind of second one, except in the economic sector. And so I think it's the last 30 years have shown the Russian government that they feel they can trust China. They know tension are there, but they feel that they understand the red line, while they have the feeling that the US is not respecting Russia's red line for example, in Ukraine. So it's a long-term management. It has been border management. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization has really been the socializing diplomatic structure for Russian diplomats and Chinese one to kind of try to find a common language. And then, as Evan was mentioning for Latin America, I mean, authoritarian regimes have ways to discuss with each other and find ways to compromise on a very concrete ground.
Unfortunately, we're out of time today, but thank you so much to our panelists for this excellent discussion. Obviously, there's many more things we'd like to talk about if we had more time. So back to you, General Howard.
Hey, what a great start for the day. Good job, panel. Great job, Rebecca.